past, present, and future. And we acknowledge the truth of violence perpetrated in the name of this country and make a commitment to uncovering that truth through dialogue, partnerships, and learning.
Thank you, David. All right, so again, thank you all so much for joining us. There is a lot going on in the world right now where we want to put our time and energy and attention. And I know that a lot of us are trying to be very intentional where we kind of point our focus. And so we're very thankful that you've chosen this conversation today to spend an hour kind of thinking through some pretty tough stuff with us. I want to just kind of set a little bit of an intention for this conversation. We are hoping that this is not a kind of, we're hoping you're not expecting like a conversation about lists. What to do, what do I say, how do I do this? We don't position ourselves in any kind of expertise around that. We're really hoping to have a transparent conversation, really more about process. How are we processing a moment as individuals? How are we processing the moment as an institution? How do we use our platform responsibly? And kind of how do we approach all these questions? So we have a lot of learning to do. We're doing a lot of learning and growing every day, as many of us, across the world are. And so, we're going to talk through that and hear your thoughts on it. I'm going to ask David and David a few questions. And if you have questions, please feel free to message them to Blair in the chat. If you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to put your questions in the YouTube chat. We'll be moderating that as well. Your questions will be passed along to me, and I will pass them along to David and David. We only have an hour, so we'll try to get to as many questions and kind of thoughts as we can. And so the kind of impetus for this conversation is these pieces of writing that have been published on our website, 4 pieces, 2 by David Howse, 2 by David Dower, that are kind of in response to this moment of institutions processing and individuals processing and responding to the murders that have happened this spring and the kind of uprising of organizing and energy in response to them. And I would love to start off kind of where those pieces of writing start, which is a piece from David Howse. And in preparation for this conversation, we were discussing, David, how that first piece isn't quite the institutional statement as we've come to see many institutions and companies offer. It's really more of a personal reflection. And I would love if you could talk a little bit about how you knew it was time to share publicly and kind of what got you to that moment of that statement.
Thank you, Kevin. Before I jump into that question, I want to thank everybody for joining us for what I hope is a real and meaningful conversation. It always seems to be that way for us at ArtsEmerson, particularly between David and myself, and we're really honored to welcome you into the conversation. And just to start us off on a kind of funny note, as the town hall was getting started, I noticed that David Dower was unmuted and I couldn't unmute myself. And I thought, okay, this in and of itself is racism because they won't let me talk. But anyway, they did let me take me off mute. And so now I have a voice. so thank you. Yeah, so to your question, Kevin, which is a really good one. And that the moment that we all experienced some few weeks ago, my instinct was not to make a statement to the public. And so as you perhaps learned through one of the pieces that we put on the blog, the statement that became ArtsEmerson's statement was one of 2 things. It was a note that I had written to my dear white friends, whom I love dearly and whom I know love me. And the first statement was to the staff. And my intention of both focusing internally and inside my network was one of a bit of a reaction, and it was all I knew to do. My intention with the staff was to say that I know when these issues come up, when we see the devaluation of Black bodies, when we see the murdering of Black bodies, we can distance that, even as close as it is on our screen. And I just wanted my team to know that their George Floyd was sitting right close to them inside the organization, in fact, trying to lead this organization. So for me, the instinct was not about a broadcast to console, to inform, to air my own personal trauma and sort of struggle through this, but to actually speak to the people closest to me, to say, you should know that this is where I am. And in some ways apologizing, so if they didn't hear from me, or if they got a snipe or a snap from me, they knew the origins of that sort of that reaction. And so it was not about a public message. I didn't feel in that moment that even as a leader of an organization, I had enough to say to a public and to our audience in that moment. But I did want to make sure that the people closest to me, the people that we're working with inside, had a sense of where I was standing very personally. And so then it morphed into something more. Oh, now reverse. No, David can't talk. Oh, I love this. I'll just keep going. And then in 1 second.
Okay, there we go. No, sorry, everyone. Well, it's live. It's like theater. But one thing that I did want to just share, and I hope it's okay, David, this statement to your white network in particular, it wasn't the first time that I had received an email like that from you. And I think the most recent moment prior was just a week or so before that, when you were trying to unpack the Ahmaud Arbery circumstance, and also trying to let us know where you were and how you were. And so I think it's, and we talked about this, maybe we'll get into it more later, but these things move very quickly, even though they seem to move not at all in some other ways. So David, your ability to share with us as soon as you can share where you personally are in it helps, for me personally, it keeps me informed, it keeps me close to you as these events are zooming by. And it's part of what became the situation of what statement do we even make that you saw in the emails, was that this wasn't the first thing. It didn't come from nowhere. It hadn't, this was in continuity with a number of other things where we had, you and I and sort of behind the scenes, sort of found our voice together, taken our time to find our what the official voice was going to be, if anything. But I just want to remind everyone that this event was on top of several other very disturbing moments that preceded it.
Yeah, it was one that I'm glad you're reminding me of Ahmaud Arbery, and glad you're reminding me, and hard to be reminded, but it was just a week or so earlier that I had written in reflection of a piece of artwork that I acquired that spoke exactly to that moment that we were in, and I wrote a piece and shared it with friends. But it was really the first time the piece that you all read was the first time it actually, in such a public way, shared my own personal story in it. You probably can imagine, and by the color of my skin, sort of what I deal with on a day-to-day basis, but it hadn't been so clear and made it so personal. And I think it was just the accumulation of the activities that sort of, it just burst out of me, right? And it felt like totally, in some ways, and if you can understand, unprofessional. And it also didn't feel very CEO-like or executive-like, but it was all that I knew to do. And I knew that it was from my heart. And I have to say that I had written it maybe 24 hours in advance and held on to it for all the reasons I just described. And then I received one note from a friend who also was sharing a very vulnerable moment publicly. And I thought, okay, now I need to do this. And I actually sent the message, and then was heartened to see so many Black executives, Black leaders, Black CEOs coming out with very personal statements, including our own President Lee Pelton. It was comforting because I realized that this was a moment that felt different for many of us than all the others. And so that statement then led to becoming an organizational statement, because I didn't feel like we were in any way prepared to make any more commitments or outline any actions, for our organization. But we did want to share our humanity and our vulnerability and our struggle in it together.
Yeah.
I think there's something about that process of pause that you just mentioned, David Howse, and you kind of mentioned it, David Dower, as well. And there was a moment when you worked together to kind of see what the institutional voice of the thing is. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that tension and where how your collaboration comes into play in when a very personal experience becomes an organization's statement. I mean, it's not the perfect word, but how you work together kind of through that and what that process feels like and how you navigate it.
You want me to start there, David?
Yeah, go for it.
So, I guess this is in some ways a confession of where I am in my own work. But because I have had the extreme privilege of working so closely with David Howse, and because I have been on that receiving list of earlier pieces that he's written to his friends, his white friends in particular, I have become accustomed to waiting for David to speak on these matters. And the first thing that came to me was the staff email, and the second thing that came was the email to white colleagues. And in that, and friends, and in that email, there was a very specific ask, which was, what are you going to do? I don't necessarily need your sort of statements back. I need you to do something. And so what I ended up doing immediately, I went immediately into action because that's a white thing. I just jumped right into solving things, and I started to write to my family, white colleagues, and even some challenging emails to people that I expected to be challenged back by, but just to try to enter what David was asking for. And that's where I was. And nothing came, and I stayed there. And even like all day on that Sunday, I was off email, and I was visiting my wife's family, and we were having conversations. And I got back on Sunday night, and there was something, I can't remember now what, David, something about, we haven't said anything yet. And there was some pressure coming from the staff because we hadn't said anything. And I realized I had been waiting for you. And so you see that in the email. I asked, was this mine to do, and did I miss that? So what happened with me was that I went right into working on it, as opposed to working with David on it, and waiting for David to speak for us. And that's something that I still don't know how to handle necessarily, but David and I have enough trust and enough history that I know when I make a mistake, there will be generosity coming back. And so another time I might make the other decision and make a different mistake, but I have a sense of trust, but also I have to acknowledge that I'm always tentative.
Yeah. And I will say that it's hard to know. Both things are true at the same time, right? Yes, it was something for you to do. And I was like, where in the world are you? And why aren't you saying something? Don't you know what I'm feeling right now? There's that part. And the second part was like, no, you can't say anything. Of course you can. You don't even know what to say, And so both living in both of those truths is incredibly complicated. And I would say, even though it was really the sort of an important moment in the history of our relationship as co-leaders, it's not the first time that we've had to navigate through that. And I would say one of the, joys and privileges of having shared leadership is you both have your own styles of leading and your own voices, and neither one is the organization's voice. And so we're constantly grappling for what's mine, what's yours, and what is the organization's. And sometimes we get it right, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes it has more of David's voice, sometimes it has more of my voice, but that's a constant struggle and a beautiful struggle. So it's not like we hate doing it. It's, an ongoing dialogue around what is it that the organization needs to be saying, and what part of your voice needs to be heard in that, what part of my voice needs to be heard in that. And so I think that's how that statement came together. And what I had actually given all I could give. I had written that note to my white friends. I had written the note to the staff. I had nothing else to say. I'm like, what more do you want, from me? And so you'll hear me say in the exchange, like, just take those letters and do something with them. Like, you do it. You make something. I've said enough. And David, obligingly was like, sure, I will take those. And kind of took them and added a couple words, mushed those two words, letters together, and it resulted in that organizational statement, which for me, and we had a bit of a conversation around that, I mean, I don't know, it feels very different from a lot of the other commitment statements that I started to very quickly flood my inbox. And I knew that I had reached a point when I got one from PetSmart about how much PetSmart cares about Black lives. I was like, okay, now this is a little much. I believe them, I want to believe them, but why now? And so then we started to think about sort of what is it we can commit to in these moments, and what are the actions that we're trying to take, and why do we need to broadcast those? What happens when you just do it? And part of the performative nature of the announcement is what gives me pause. And I'm not questioning always the good intention behind it, but I'm challenged by the need to perform those actions.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a very kind of performative moment. I mean, just kind of by nature, so much of what we've talked about thus far has been about the institution, but I think down to the individual level, there's this kind of pressure of whether it's in social media or in your family, the right instinct and the right pressure to speak up and to add your voice. But David Howse, you mentioned the other day, if it's something you're not used to, it's going to feel very performative. If it's a conversation that you're new to, it's kind of it's almost inevitably going to feel performative. And so I wonder a little bit about, how do you two prep for that performance? Like, what is like the rehearsal for the performance? How do you know that you are, how do you even navigate? I mean, I love what you said, David Howse, like, you want the action to speak for the organization, for the individual, but you know that the moment is kind of calling for a spoken part, a written commitment. How do you prep for that?
I don't know that I have the right answer. And I do know that what felt right in that moment for us is, again, my instinct, let me use my I statements, my instinct was to be internally focused. And it became something that became a public acknowledgement. But for me, the process of getting through the rehearsal and the performance goes way back. And it goes back to commitments and internal work that we've been doing at ArtsEmerson, in particular with our staff, around undoing racism, undoing oppression, in many, many ways. It's reflected in some of our programming, but certainly, and more importantly, it's reflected in our how we're trying to live our lives inside the organization. And so for me, that's all part of the rehearsal. And the performance feels more authentic because there is a bit of a track record, even if it's an internal track record, around how to talk about these things, how to speak authentically inside them. And in many ways, that sort of track record is what turned me more inward than outward, because again, I didn't want to be a part of the herd mentality. And part of what you heard in the message was like, if we're too slow to get something out, it's like we're following the other organizations and we're just doing it because others are doing it. And so there was that pressure to get something out. But for me, it was more about the rehearsal being internal and the commitment to our team to what we're going to do. And I'm reminded of the words of Maya Angelou in this moment. We can always look to Maya Angelou in these moments. And she says, and I'm paraphrasing, but people won't remember exactly what you said or what you did, but they'll always remember how you made them feel, right? And so in this moment, it was, for me, the commitment was, if I make a statement and the people inside my organization can't feel their experience inside that statement, then we have more work to do. And I'm hesitant to communicate outwardly, look at all the things we're going to do and look at all the commitments, if I look internally and my staff members, particularly those who are more deeply impacted by racism and other oppressions, if they can't feel their experience in those statements, then it feels very much like a performance. Yeah. And so I, think about how we're trying to make sure that that sense of belonging, being an action that we can do internally before we communicate outwards, is kind of part of that rehearsal that you're talking about before the performance.
Yeah, it's really interesting, this rehearsal performance notion, because I feel like I try to resist the performance itself and just try to make sure that I'm still doing the work. But I know I don't have to perform in the same way. I move through the world without an expectation of a performance layer in a lot of ways that many of my colleagues, people of color in particular, don't get to generally in a moment like that. So I would say, and I think this is true, that I don't, I actually stay at the rehearsal until the thing that I'm doing doesn't feel like a performance. And so, like, even in that moment, we were working, Kevin, you and I, and Ryan, we were working on the marquees, and to make sure that the marquees were truthful and authentically ours to say, and we were working on all these other things. But I felt pulled by some kind of, like, the call-in culture, which is, really closely related to the call-out culture. I felt pulled by others to perform a statement, but actually we were busy doing the work. And so I didn't want to do that. And it wasn't until David, raised it with me that I felt like, oh, I see why we have to, and let's find ours, what is true for us. But I didn't want to, and I think I might have stayed here to this day, would not, if I were individually leading ArtsEmerson to this day, I would not have issued one of those statements. I would have found something to do that felt like we were actually doing the work, and maybe people would see it and maybe they wouldn't. But that's a privilege that I would have, and it's not a privilege that the staff has. The staff was getting called out by friends because their organization hadn't made a statement yet. So yeah, it was. But I don't want it to be a performance. I never want it to be a performance. Yeah, that's all I know how to say. That's all I can say.
Performance in some ways is sorry, Kevin, let me just add this. The performance in many ways is the easy part, right? It's very easy to make a statement. It's very easy to go to a protest and raise one's hand. The actual rehearsal, the self-reflection and the self-interrogation is the hard part. That is the rehearsal. And I think that's what we've been challenging ourselves inside the organization to do, just do good work. But then the question becomes, what does it mean when you don't make a statement? When an organization doesn't make a statement? How are they then seen? Are then they more racist? So it's a really complicated moment, and no one has an easy way. And I think what I'm heartened by is that most of these are really good intentions coming from the right place. But it really matters, and this is where I think that the gift of this biracial relationship, this biracial leadership, is that to have a proximity to someone who lives inside that experience, to help inform, to give nuance, to shape, is powerful. Most of our institutions don't have that privilege, and so I think that's one of the benefits, and it also makes it much harder, in some ways. But my hope is that what results from that sort of struggle, from that hard work, is something that's really meaningful, that's encouraging, that's uplifting, and that actually is a model And this notion of modeling is one that I personally struggle with, because I'm rarely the one to say, look at all the good work that we're doing. It makes me a very bad fundraiser, because I'm not the one to say, oh my God, we're so great. And we had a wonderful ramble walk with San San Wong at the Bar Foundation, a dear friend of ours, who really challenged us to think about the absence of voice in this moment, particularly for us, is notable, because we have responsibility as leaders in our community, in our organization, to be able to say something. And so that's something I personally continue to struggle with, because I never wanted to feel like being braggadocious, or that we're so much better, or we've got it all figured out. But there is a balance. And what you hear, or I hope you hear in this conversation, is that all these things are true at the same time, and trying to figure out what feels right in the moment is the best that we can do. And the statements that we came out with, the communications that we've come out with of late, felt like the best thing that we could do in that moment.
Yeah. You know, you said something earlier, David, that I want to go back to, which is why now? And I think that's part of my fundamental skepticism about these statements, is why did it take that for you to signal that? There had been so much evidence over so many years, and your organization is how old? And and so now in this, and I'm really am curious about that. Like, what is it about those 8 minutes and 40 seconds of video that actually caused organizations to do that, to say that? And then what will actually result from it? I guess it is a point of pride, and maybe a inappropriate brag, but ArtsEmerson didn't need that moment to get us to start the work. We've been at it from, basically from the beginning in many ways, but really in a focused and intentional way, strategic way, since you arrived, David. We've been working at it internally. And we're not even there yet. Like what's so, that was part of the thing for me, watching all that happen. It's like, you're jumping in right now with these big statements about what you're committed to. And we have for 5 years been working on this together in a biracial shared leadership notion. And we're not to what your statement says yet. And so you started from that statement and have no idea what the distance is, and how challenging it's going to be to cover that terrain. And so that why now is, and I want to go back to something that Claudia Rankin said right after the Women's March. And she was on a panel at the Public Theater. And I forget who it was, David Remnick was asking, I forget who she was on there with. I know Tony Kushner and somebody else, Salman Rushdie. And he was asking if the Women's March felt like a watershed moment, and why now? And I think, somebody, and I forget, I don't want to put words in somebody's mouth, but somebody was talking about, it was interesting. It was, it was women from all, it was a diverse group of women all out in the streets. And Claudia was saying, but I'm really curious, why now? Why the bodies dropping in the streets weren't enough to get you all out. Like, so she wasn't celebrating necessarily the Women's March as a watershed moment. She was actually looking at, why did it take Trump's election, it was what the response was, and why this panel was happening. Why did it take that to get people out on the street when Michael Brown and Tamir Rice and all these other incidents hadn't gotten us there? And this question of intersectionality that came up around then, and now we're seeing it in these statements that all of a sudden we're jumping to this commitment as a result of those 8 minutes on tape. I don't know why now. I guess I'm glad that now, but I don't know why it took that.
I would just add there, this as a result of the why now, and the fact that, the power of the image, I'll just say that, the power of the image to bring truth for so many people. is incredible. I think back to Frederick Douglass and his use of image to make himself visible, to state himself, to dignify himself, to, to be provocation to so many people. I think about this image, and, the result is that for years, as you say, David, people have been saying, this is the experience and it takes this. And so I hope that people understand why personally I live at the intersection of deep skepticism and radical hope, right? And I am working through the deep skepticism to get to the radical hope aspect, to get to the generosity of it, and to get to the excitement of it. Because as I say, that for too long, these commitments, these movements have gotten a lot of energy, and then we go back to normal. Well, for so many people, normal is incredible fear and death on a daily basis, right? And so I live at that intersection. So many of us live at that intersection where we want to believe all these things, right? And so we have to navigate that. And so while it's new for so many people, there are many who are saying, yes, and for 400 plus years, these are the stories. And so for me as a leader and personally to be able to lead from a place of love and generosity means that I had to get through all of that skepticism, all of that doubt, all of that anger, all that frustration to find that place. And it's taken a couple of weeks, to sort of move through, the rawness of it, to find that generous spirit. And my hope is that, I'm managing my expectations, not because I'm not optimistic and because I don't believe. It's just because we have a history that has shown us so much, something different. And so these are all the things that are cycling through one's mind when one is saying, how do I communicate to the greater world? All these things. And how do I represent an organization that is made up of all kinds of experiences and all kinds of people? Like, how do I use my voice to find that balance between a challenge and encouragement, right? And so that's what we are striving to do in our programming and in our messaging, trying to say, don't get so comfortable with the raised fist at the protest, right? So what happens when you leave the protest? What happens when the curtain comes down on that performance? What more needs to be done? So the gestures are incredibly encouraging, but there's so much more that is required. And so this is kind of, the inside thinking of how do you make a statement on behalf of an organization that speaks truth, that keeps people perhaps inspired, but not comfortable in where we are.
Yeah, this is so great. So we have a few questions that I think are molding together really well kind of at this moment. So one of them is, so David Dower, you mentioned, we've been at ArtsEmerson, we've been in this work for a while, and David Howse, you talk about kind of this intersection of radical hope and skepticism, and I think a lot of us have had moments of that internally as we've done this work over the years, right? So there's a moment where maybe 2 years ago, the ArtsEmerson staff did the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond training, and afterwards, the staff was like ready to go, ready to jump in, ready to make a statement, ready for action. And so in the comments, we have Artisans Asylum sharing a similar instinct from part of their community right now. Like their board is ready for action and they're wondering, how do we kind of make sure we're doing that internal process right? How are we actually taking the time? And I think it takes a little bit of that internal skepticism to say, okay, before we jump into a thing, how are we continuing this work? I mean, even 5 years in, a moment like this happens and we can kind of see pressure points in the institution internally in our, and then in our personal lives and all of our relationships where, oh gosh, I thought I was a little further along in this. I thought we were a little further along in this. Mm-hmm. And just to kind of add one more lens to this kind of reflection of that skepticism as a productive reason for pause, Ty Furman offers a question about kind of the specificity of doing this work in Boston. Sansan mentioned you all as being important voices, us all being important voices in our community. Boston has its own very specific history of segregation, of a kind of a wide spectrum of racism and microaggressions that still play out every day. So how do you approach this process towards action in this city specifically, and how does skepticism play into that?
I'm going to say a quick response to that second part of the question around Boston specifically. And, racism is racism is racism. For me, it doesn't feel any different here in Boston than it feels in New York, than it feels in Europe, and so the work is the work, right? And part of what we have to do is start to have the conversations and hold each other accountable to our, espoused values around how much we care about other. But for me, we happen to live in Boston. This is a city that has a history. Every city has its history. It shows up, it's showing up in these moments. And I don't know that we think about it differently. I mean, we have systemic issues that are plaguing every aspect of our lives, whether we can see it on a daily basis or whether it reveals itself through a friend or through tragedies like the one that recently happened. Those issues are omnipresent, and they feel the same to me in every city that I go in. So I don't think of Boston being unique in its challenge to combat racism and undo the oppression that exists in this city. But I do think we have the benefit of having a smaller city to navigate, and we have closer relationships because I call it a high bump rate city because we're so small. We have the capacity to actually do it perhaps differently and more quickly because we are manageable as a city, but I don't know that that's enough to say that we're unique and it's a special circumstance here.
Mm-hmm. I would come back to that first part of that question too, and just encourage everybody who's listening on this call, and some of you probably this is preaching to the choir or will feel patronizing, and I don't mean that in any way, but the instinct to get to work actually really needs to be focused on yourself first. And that's something that David came into the organization with and really put us through, a lot of self-reflection and then, together, shared conversation and reflection about our personal transformations and how that work has to precede organizational or societal transformation. And Daniel Beatty does a similar thing, and we were working a little bit with Daniel's formulation there as well. But the instinct to get to work to solve the problems of the culture or problems even of the organization, if it's not built on the practice of developing your own transformation individually, then it's going to fade the minute the cameras look away and the minute the funding dries up or the minute the next cataclysm happens in some other direction. So unless it's a daily practice of where are you on your own journey, where am I? And like you said, Kevin, I'm frequently just the last town hall we had with the staff, I came up against my own current state of internal affairs and had to reflect on that based on really generous but important feedback from the staff. So we can't build the mission and purpose of the organization on top of something that's not being actively pursued individually within the organization.
I just want to add one thing, because you're hearing David being very generous around what I brought and what I do and how I'm leading the organization through. I will say that it is a full-time job. That is not my job, to do it. But then I ask the question, if not me, then who? I can't, as a leader, I can't outsource this part of the work. And it's the same for an individual. We can't individually outsource, our own issues. We have to deal with them head on. And so our commitment to sort of working internally first is incredibly important because, we can have, I can't forget the Harvard professor who talked about strategy, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? We can have the most amazing strategies around how we want to privilege Black artists, but if we don't have a culture where those Black artists feel that they are valued in the same way, then it won't be successful. So we spend a lot of time on those efforts internally, because for me as a leader, I, as well as David, we have to be modeling and leading what we believe is right and important for the organization, and not thinking about it as an HR function or as an affinity group function. We actually have to start with ourselves in that work. So it sounds like it is a full-time job, but it is not the only job, right? And part of what you're hearing is, as a Black leader, a lot of that feels like it lays on me. And I wrestle with that often, because you can very quickly be seen as, oh, all the race stuff happens in this part of the screen, and all the other stuff happens in that part of the screen, and no one wants to be seen in one part of their identity, right? And so it is something that David and I talk about. We've been talking about that since day one. Many of you may remember an article that was published right after I came on board, when there were 3 of us leading the organization. And it just wasn't right. And we started very early on about talking around, whose voice is this? And who gets to say what and when? And that sort of dialogue continues. And you see that continuing in the piece that came out in the blog recently.
I wonder if you can speak a little bit about, Lisa, Michael asked a question about when we were discussing kind of the performance at the rehearsals leading up to, who's the audience? And I think that at this point, for me, that question feels like, who are we accountable to? Who is holding us accountable, and who are we holding accountable? I say we, I don't have to answer the question. Who are you holding accountable, and who do you feel holds you accountable?
Just really quickly, while you get your own thoughts together on that, I would say that there are a number of people on this call who hold me accountable, and I appreciate every one of them, staff and audience equally. That's what I was writing about, that last piece, is without that skepticism and without that willingness to actually call for accountability, and I appreciate it when it's kind, but that can't be a condition of accepting it. So it's really the audience and the staff. And the audience, I'm really pleased to say, over the work that we've done over the years, that our audience comes from many different communities. And so we are being held accountable in a bunch of different directions. I am personally accountable in a bunch of different directions in a way that has enriched my life and enhanced my own work and transformation.
Yeah, I would just add that, accountability comes at different levels. We as leaders of an organization are accountable to many different areas. We've made statements around our commitments to the city. We've made commitments to our audience. We've made commitments to our staff. And all those level of accountability matter to me. But at the end of the day, and I say this often, I need to feel good about every decision and choice I make when I put my head on my pillow every night. And so the most important accountability is me being accountable to myself. Can I feel good about a conversation that I had with someone who was different from me? Can I sleep well at night knowing that I sort of oppressed someone in a meeting or talked over someone for a meeting or sort of was rude? So for me, all the accountability that we see in our lives, at the end of the day, I need to feel accountable to myself and feel good about, or bad, about those decisions that I make. And I think if we internalize that accountability and do it less for fanfare or applause, externally, we may be in a different place. But we're in an environment now that everyone posts their pictures, and nothing again, perhaps we've all posted pictures around our protest on social media, but that's not the point, right? And so we have to think about, what am I actually doing with that anger? What am I doing with that visual protest? And so for me, accountability has to start with him or herself, with him or herself.
Yeah, I would say another thing around that personal accountability from how I feel, how I sleep at night. Well, it's really changed. I think it's changed pretty dramatically in these last couple of weeks. And when I say why now, I'm asking other people why now. But for me, the answer personally to the why now is the look on Derek Chauvin's face. The casual nature with which he stares at the camera for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And the absolute confidence he has that he has the right. And it's the same right that Amy Cooper had when you look at that video. And it's the same right that the McMichaels and that guy whose name, Brian, I think is his name, the one who hunted him with his truck to trap Arbery into that situation. I see all those white faces and I realize that I have been so focused on the Black suffering that I haven't taken the responsibility for the white side of the equation. And I've been empathizing and allyship and all of the things that I've been doing, that I've been at work on, have allowed me to avoid the Derek Chauvins in my own family, the Amy Coopers in my own family, and I haven't picked up that work. And if I'm not going to pick up that work, I cannot leave that to David Howse to do. David Howse cannot do that work safely, let alone effectively. And so for me, that series of white faces, the man who hit Arbery with his truck and then tried to claim he was a hero, has some kind of special sense of what I am willing to tolerate from him. And that's a new level of accountability that I hadn't had until those 5 faces all showed up at once in my news.
I'm thinking about how we move. First of all, thank you both for sharing so personally throughout the hour. We're coming down on time, so if there's a question that someone watching is feeling urgently, please feel free to pass it on. I'm thinking about the gift of feedback and accountability that we give and we receive. I think framing it as a gift, kind of, which we often try to do in the organization, kind of keeps things tilted towards radical hope, on the radical hope to deep skepticism spectrum. And so as we, as you both feel these realizations, these deep moments, as you are being called in, as you are going in the process of calling others in, how do you keep it framed as a gift? How do you hear feedback as a gift, and how do you give feedback as a gift? Because I think it's helpful to be clear on that if we are going to not let this be a moment, but instead a level up in a very long movement. So how do we stay open to it and be open as we give it?
That's a wonderfully challenging question to sort of to wrestle with. And I guess I would say that we have to continue to live at the intersection that I described earlier of skepticism and hope. And we have to believe that most people have really good intentions, right? And it takes a lot of effort and energy and nuance to deliver feedback in a way that people can receive it. And I often couch my gifts in, letting people know, meta communication, like what I'm offering is a gift. This is coming out of generosity, which allows them to receive it. But we have to be able to have those honest, brutal conversations with each other, because oftentimes we can't see ourselves and how we live in the world. And, I often say to people, when someone tells you they're offended, just believe them. Don't make them show it to you. Don't make them have to convince you. Just believe them and say thank you, right? And so this notion of being a generous giver, but also a generous receiver, takes practice. It takes a lot of practice. And if you don't live inside a space that is constantly practicing that, or it's a one-way practice, it makes it more challenging. So I would say, surround yourself with people who will check you, who will hold you accountable, who will ask you questions, who will ask you to say more about that statement. I think that is the benefit that we have in bringing people across difference together, because we do get to sit maybe for 1 second in the shoe or walk in the step of someone who's different from us and be able to say, no, that's not the step, right? You took that wrong. Let me tell you what I really meant. That is a gift, to have proximity to people and then to be able to receive the gift of that proximity. And so my hope is, and again, I said it so many times, it's through the arts. That is my intervention. That is my protest. Right. And my hope is that using the art to bring people together so that we can say, when you think about the Black experience, you see this, but this is what I need you to see as well. You see Black suffering, you see drugs, you see murder, you see these things, but you don't actually get to see exuberance. You don't get to see success. You don't get to see wealth. And so part of this is saying an invitation when you're giving that feedback for people to reimagine and to sort of let go of what they think about a person or a thing. So this sense of giving gifts is, for me, the most generous approach to tell you what I really need you to understand about my experience. And in my telling, that is work for me. It is much easier for me to just bow my head and keep going. We have to figure out ways to deliver feedback that's not comfortable, in ways that you can hear it, not to make you defensive, but so that you can reflect on the question that was asked or the gift that was given.
And that beautifully said, David. Thank you. I have a smaller thing to say, and it's just that if I could, I would take out of our language the conditional apology. If I offended you, I'm sorry. And to this, just believe them. Any apology you ever see or hear that says, if I, is not a genuine apology. And so in these moments where feedback is coming that requires you to apologize, not only just accept and receive, believe it, but apologize for it without the conditions attached. And leave the apology alone. It's the end of the apology. I apologize, but is not an apology. So all the conditional apologies we hear from all of our leaders and so many directions, and all these perpetrators now who are making their apologies. Oh, I promise I'll do better in the future. Just apologize and leave it and move on, work harder.
So it feels like we're coming to a natural close, and as we do, I am actually just going to ask that we sit, and I have my timer open. I'm going to ask that we just sit for 30 seconds and kind of reflect and center one thing or an idea, a response that's just kind of reverberating that we want to make sure we take with us all from this conversation. You won't be asked to share it or anything. I want to honor and acknowledge that a lot of deeply personal things have been said, and I'm sure have been thought for those of you watching. So I'm just going to time for 30 seconds starting now. Thank you. It feels so odd to take moments like that when you're in a digital space, but I think we've talked a little bit about the value of making space to pause, and so thank you for taking that time with us all. If you have thoughts, if you have further questions, if you have things you'd like to hold us accountable to or grapple with us, Blair has shared in the chat, the ways to get a hold of us, all the usual ways: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you, David and David, for sharing. It's a long road that we're all on, but it's easier the more people you walk it with. And 115 of us have been on this conversation for an hour.
Yeah,
We're
amazing.
privileged to walk with you, and we look forward to continuing.
Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, everyone.
For guiding us through the conversation. We look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you.